So I'd like to welcome everybody to our first ever composer interview, and we're super excited to be starting this, and we're super excited to have with us today Gabriel Bolaños, who is currently an assistant professor at Arizona State University, which I did my master's there. um, so yeah, I think we're just going to get started. Gabriel is going to present some work and share some stuff with us, and then he and I will kind of have a little chat, and then at the very end we'll have an opportunity for you guys to chime in and ask some questions. All right, so I'll pass it over to Gabriel.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here today, sharing a little bit of my music with you. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So as Beth mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. The weather is finally bearable here in Arizona. I imagine if you're in Boston, it's probably getting kind of cold, but it's beautiful and sunny out right now. And despite the weather, I've been cooped up in my studio here, working on an electric guitar quintet for the past maybe past few months. So I was hoping to share a little bit of this piece with you, some of the creative process that I employed sort of developing the ideas for the piece, my approaches towards notation, and at the end I'll play through a little bit of a mock-up of the piece that I recorded myself. I grew up actually playing guitar. The electric guitar was my first instrument. So in many ways, this felt kind of like a return to my roots. I haven't written anything for guitar in over 10 years. It was kind of an interesting project, personal project for me. I think before jumping into this piece, because it's a very unusual piece, it would be helpful to contextualize some of my work more broadly. I'm a composer. I was trained mostly in acoustic music. I did my doctorate at UC Davis, where the students were rotated between the faculty members every year. So I received pretty eclectic training. And then most recently, in the past 10 years or so, I've been focusing a lot of my energies on electronic and electroacoustic music. I got really into computer-assisted composition tools like Open Music. I don't know if any composers have heard of that. And then more sort of bread and butter software like Maxim SP that's very powerful, very robust. And what really drew me to electronic or electroacoustic music is actually the way of thinking about electronics. It's not really the technology. I'm not like a programmer or anything, but it's the way, certain ways of applying electronic or electroacoustic thinking to acoustic music. I came to this realization studying with a Mexican composer, Rodrigo Sigal, who told me very cleverly that just because you write something on the computer on Microsoft Word doesn't mean that you're a technologist, right? Just because we create music with electronic music tools doesn't mean we're creating electronic music. And the opposite is true. You can actually create electronic music with purely acoustic instruments by applying studio metaphors for the studio or ways of thinking about electronics to inform your acoustic thinking. And that's really what I'm extremely interested in right now. And so this electric guitar piece, I'll pull up a little bit of the score here for you. One of the questions I continually ask myself while writing it is, how can I make the electric guitar something that to me is almost excessively familiar? How can I make it sound like something different, like something new? And so I began actually with physically just getting my hands on an instrument and playing it. And I began with essentially pure sonic materials. And I discovered this technique where if you take a slide, I don't have one here with me. Oh, here we go. A guitar slide, essentially. And you just tap on the string quite lightly. You can hear the pitch where the slide touches the string. So if you're very high on the fingerboard, it's a really high, extremely high pitch. And I thought about how to notate some of these pitches. And I came up with a sort of interesting microtonal chord progression using some computer-assisted composition tools here in open music. And for example, opening 3 right here, these are essentially the chords of the opening of the piece. It's just kind of like a harmony that gets slightly distorted as the piece progresses. And then there are certain little things that jump out and add an element of surprise. But the point of departure here was actually the technique and an attempt to make the guitars sound like they're not guitars. To add an added element of confusion and of, I guess, a surreal experience for the audience, I also decided to spatialize the guitars around the audience. So when this is performed in December, the stage will be empty, the lights will be turned down, and there will be 5 electric guitars surrounding the audience, each with their own amplifier. And then of course, this poses, it's an interesting listening experience because you're completely surrounded by sound, but it poses a lot of logistical problems for the performers. How do you coordinate if you can't really see each other? So to get around this, I basically have all of the guitarists use a stopwatch. And this was out of purely practical reasons, just because I wanted the spatialization, essentially. But this actually opened up some new possibilities. Now, instead of thinking of meter, of a particular pulse or a fixed rhythm that everyone is coordinated to, I was thinking more in terms of durations. So this also freed up the possibility to think compositionally about time a little bit differently. And I began to think more than thinking about subdivisions of beats or regular meters or time signatures or anything like that. I began thinking a lot more about proportion and duration and morphology and the way certain sounds can melt or coalesce between each other. And I spent a considerable amount of time working on these proportions. And one thing that I discovered is that, for example, here you have a static harmony. Everyone is tapping these little Morse code rhythm. And then for about 15 seconds, everybody is slowly glissandoing or sliding to the next pitch in the harmony. And during those periods where the glissandos are occurring, it's a period of great instability, of course. And imagine being in the audience and hearing all the pitches around you glissing at different rates. And at the same time, there are little sort of free rhythmic changes. These voices slow down a little bit as they're sliding. And then when they arrive to the new harmony, things stabilize again. And the texture, the density of these textures changes. So a lot of the problems, or I guess the points of departure of the piece, informed the actual compositional material, which I found to be really interesting. Ultimately, because I wanted to make the guitar as unrecognizable as possible, I tried to stay away from regular playing techniques as much as possible. I know this can occasionally sound gimmicky if a piece is all extended techniques. You know, you have a couple kitchen sink pieces. Of course, I think we've all written those where you try everything on an instrument. But in this case, I tried to keep it to a really tight economy of extended techniques, but avoiding any possible resemblance of normal electric guitar playing. And because of the nature of this initial sound, the tapping on the string, that's a very, very delicate sound. I decided subvert expectations a little bit more, don't have any loud, aggressive, violent sounds at all in the piece. Everything is really light, really irregular, really delicate, really unstable, very hard to control and requires a lot of finesse. And I thought it was an interesting way of also thinking about this instrument that was incredibly revolutionary and often kind of subverted expectations in the opposite way by being extremely loud and with distortion being extremely violent and sort of metal, you know, literally and figuratively. So after making these initial decisions, I created essentially a bank of techniques that were all delicate, unrecognizable, and relatively easy to play because, again, this is following the stopwatch, playing in darkness, not seeing the other performers poses a lot of challenges. I didn't want to stress the performance out too much. So I also didn't want to create techniques that were excessively difficult or unstable. So there are periods where there's a fast glissando and you hear a resemblance of like a normal slide guitar, pew, something like that. But everyone moves in relative rhythmic unison. So it creates a sensation of like a flocking motion around you. A little later in the piece, I have them tapping the slide on the string and then sliding it up and down to create some irregular vibrato. And unlike a vibrato on a violin or a bowed string instrument, these can get pretty wild. I mean, it's with a very slight flick of the wrist, you can get up to, you know, a seventh or an octave or something of a range. There's another little technique here that's kind of a tremolo, still using the slide. And what I decided to do in the B section of this piece is essentially everyone is doing tremolos. And these harmonies are all based off of 4 different overtone series, with the result being that there's a sense of kind of unity. But because they're all different overtone series, it's almost like things are moving in and out of focus around you. So there's certain elements that you might be able to perceive, but you will only be able to really latch onto it or perceive it for a short period of time before another portion of the harmony sort of emerges. This continues for a little while. And then I had the performers place alligator clips, which are these little metal clips on the strings. And to me, this was an amazing discovery because it allowed for 2 highly unrecognizable sounds. When the clip is attached a little bit loosely, usually on a higher string because the diameter is more narrow, it tends to bounce a lot. And so you get it literally sounds like a bouncing ball, pop, 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 these kind of accelerations, but with a metallic timbre because the metal of the clip is hitting the metal of the string. And if you attach the clip on one of the lower strings, because they're much thicker in diameter, they don't bounce. But what happens is it sounds like a bell, like a giant gong or something. It's really kind of an incredible sound. So with this one little preparation, you could achieve 2 very different sounds. And I really like, again, the economy of that, not demanding too much preparation of the instrument from the players. And with one little tiny thing, you get 2 highly contrasting sounds. So I introduced this bouncing element right here around minute 6. Pop, 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 pop. And notice a very slow pace of how this unravels at the beginning. We have almost 3.5 minutes of just this tapping sound. And then another 3 minutes of just this little tremolo. And then a couple alligator clips. And right here, this was the hardest thing to notate. It's essentially using the slide as a kind of a pick. So the box indicates to hold a chord with the left hand. The blue indicates how close to the bridge or the fingerboard you are. So it's moving parallel to the string. And the black indicates moving up and down the strings. And what you hear is both the chord that is being held, that I forgot to mention the guitars are retuned microtonally. So the chords are always really unfamiliar anyway. And then again, the point of contact of the slide on the really high strings. So you hear this really bizarre sort of heterophony of sound that is incredibly unrecognizable, very, very unstable, very hard to notate. So this was notated as a quasi improvisation. And in this case, I anticipate I'm going to work with the performers quite closely and rely a little bit more on just kind of oral tradition, telling them what I want, how to achieve the sound. Because it's literally, you could attempt to notate everything in detail, but it defeats the purpose because I want this to be actually kind of free and improvisatory. And then here at around minute 7:15, I introduced these bell-like sounds. It sounded like really rich, huge, beautiful gongs. And then the rest of the piece is just kind of winding down with the bell-like sounds. alternating between that, the sliding. These are very high muted strings, just muting really high on the strings and plucking. And then occasionally some players will play with an ebow, which is this cool little device that you hold over a guitar, and it allows the string to vibrate via an electromagnetic field indefinitely. So it sounds almost like a synthesized sound. It's like essentially a bow, right? An electromagnetic bow for the guitar. But of particular importance to me was the rate at which I introduced these different sounds. I wanted the audience to almost get bored with the opening. You know, it's so surprising. And then you live in it for 4, 5, 6 minutes, right? So I wanted to almost lull them into this false sense of security after being introduced to this surreal new soundscape. And then all of a sudden, start introducing a new element after new element quite quickly, until at the very end, it's all bells and these kind of sliding gestures. And it's all really quite unpredictable. And the point, I think the kind of wrangling the form in this piece was the hardest thing, because there were so many interesting techniques and materials. And I had to make as composers, we always have to make those difficult decisions of, you've worked hard on something, you've developed it, but it doesn't fit into the piece, and you have to just put it aside. And as my old composition professor used to say, you kill your darlings. You know, you have to get rid of them. And if they don't work in the piece, you have to ruthlessly sort of abandon them. And I abandoned a lot of ideas in the final stage of this piece, just to keep the sensation of form, right? A sudden introduction of all this new material at the end. So I thought I would play a little bit of this piece. We can kind of follow along. And then at the end, we'll, I don't know how much time I have to, it's about 4:20. To have a couple of minutes. Okay. These are all the very detailed performance notes. Here we go. And there you go, a nice bird's eye view. And this is hot off the press, literally just finished it yesterday. It's exciting. Anyway, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or move on to the next part of the.
Yeah, why don't we can go ahead and if anybody wants to ask questions specifically about this piece, and then we'll go on to the next section.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Could you talk a little bit about the pitches, the different pitches, what are the relationships between the pitches, and is there any kind of form to the different 5 pitches?
Absolutely. So it starts with this high C# unison. And then a lot of the harmonies that evolve right here are very high partials of a C# overtone series. Because I like the sort of unpredictability, but also unity that helps provide. So these could occasionally be something like the 14th, 18th, something, whatever partial. And this is sort of gradually developed. Occasionally the harmonies are developed somewhat intuitively until the end of this A section, which ends on this A 1/4 sharp. Everybody is sort of centered around this pitch. And then in the B section, I basically took that A 1/4 sharp as almost a pivot note. And I found it was, actually I have the sketch right here, one sec. Thinking of it almost like a pivot tone as you would in a modulation. And I discovered that it is, that A 1/4 sharp is the 4th partial, or the fundamental, of course, of the A sharp overtone series. It is the, I forgot, 10th or 11th partial of an E overtone series. It is present on a G 1/4 sharp overtone series, and quite high, the 7th partial on a C overtone series. This is rounding to the nearest quarter tone, more or less. So I took those overtone series essentially, and each voice in this section is just playing up and down different overtone series, playing slightly higher or lower partials. Always creating these little tremolos between the A 1/4 sharp and a corresponding, so this one in this case is the E major overtone series. That A sharp tremoloing with the G sharp, with the E, with the F sharp, with the B, with the E, etc. And you get this sense of things moving in and out of phase. And then in the end here, this sort of game continues. And then in the end, these harmonies were just kind of developed rather intuitively as familiar bar chords with the A 1/4 sharp in different voices, essentially of the same harmony. So I'm basically just transposing the bar chord so that the A 1/4 sharp is the 3rd or the 5th or the octave or whatever. But because the guitar is tuned microtonally, things are a little bit wonky. And in this case, really the central focus for me was more the timbre than thinking centrally about pitch or harmony. And then these kind of bell-like sounds at the end were created just on the low E and A strings. And the clip was placed at certain locations so that they descended by 1.5 or 1 1/4 whole steps as the piece progressed. So it would begin, for example, with like a place on like a B, and then it would go down to like a G 1/4 sharp. So somewhere between a major second and a minor third. And then these things just sort of progress downwards. And what I like about that interval is it's kind of symmetrical. It has like a wonky whole tone-y, somewhere between a whole tone scale and a diminished triad. feel to it. So it's symmetrical, it's unstable, and it's still a little bit unrecognizable. And then everything ends again on this A quarter sharp, which rather inadvertently became the kind of central focus of the piece, the central pitch of the piece.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions on this piece? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, if you think of something, you're obviously more than welcome to ask again later.
Absolutely.
I think Gabriel and I are, I'm just going to ask him like some sort of general questions. Trying to think of where to start. So we know, we being BNMI, know Gabriel Bolaños, first from our performance, I want to say 2017, I think, of his piece, Trip Down Market Street, which uses an old silent film and then puts basically Perot, it has percussion too, Perot plus percussion, sort of, I don't know, it's kind of a soundtrack, yeah, to the silent film. And then, yeah, so hopefully in the next year or so, he's also going to write us a new piece. But I've been looking through some of your more recent stuff. Well, I noticed a lot of things have, you have a lot of things with like a visual element to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what inspires you about using visual elements, and you know, how has it worked for you with some of those pieces?
That's a great question. I don't know why I have always been kind of a visual person. Even when I sketch, it's kind of graphic and a little bit ideas are often generated through like visual metaphors, of gesture, of motion, or something like that. So recently I've been a little bit interested in, increasingly more interested in sort of complementing my attempts at creating a musical drama or a musical narrative with accompanying visuals to create a kind of enhance the overall narrative of the work. And for A Trip Down Market Street was actually the first piece I wrote that had visuals.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot of fun because the video is just a camera that's just going down Market Street in San Francisco towards the end of the street, Embarcadero. And so the visuals have this process of it's just going down the street and approaching this building. That's all it is. And I thought that's such an elegant and clear direction. So the piece is just going to start high and get low. And that's it. That's the entire piece. I mean, there's more to it than that, of course, but that helped sort of dictate the overarching form. And I really enjoyed the sensation of having this kind of gradual descent with zooming in on this building. And a lot of my recent pieces that do feature multimedia video or image, I often attempt to create often abstract images that are as abstract as my music, but that have some kind of behavior or process or gesture that can be easily followed by anybody, which is what I attempt to also do in my music. But I think the visuals can add like an element of support. It's almost like an enhanced orchestration of an idea that also includes visuals to try to get the point across.
Yeah, I really noticed that I watched the first video of the Grand Transparence earlier and listened, Macro. If you guys, you can find all of these at Gabriel's website, which is gabrielbolaños.com. So the Grand Transparence Macro, I loved the images in this. It's like, it uses zoomed in natural images, and there's a lot of movement in it that just really corresponds well with the sounds that are going on. And I really, really enjoyed that. And I recommend that if you guys are interested in some of this audio video exploration. I also am curious about the Sendero piece that you did, like, we had another composer, Robert Kendall, that had his like impromptus, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of it. I haven't had a chance to actually play with it, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it and how it works.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe I can share my screen as well.
Sure.
To demonstrate. So this piece was, we were having problems the ASU Symphony Orchestra and ASU Wind Bands were having problems during quarantine, of course, as all performers were throughout the world. We were thinking of strategies to facilitate remote performance. And having done some experiments with graphic notation, I decided that it could be interesting to create video scores, essentially, where things are scrolling across and performers just play along. The video is essentially the score. This would allow for precise temporal coordination if with people recording remotely, but to enhance or create, I guess, an even more element of meta interactivity. Rather than just presenting fixed videos, there are a couple videos of these being interpreted. Here's one of a clarinetist. So it's almost like a video version of a Nankaro canon or something. They're scrolling at different rates, exact same voice. But to take it a step further, I contacted a friend of mine who created this website where audiences can then mix the different interpretations in real time. So this one I think is quite interesting. In this case, it's for 4 strings. And it's just these continuous glissandi between these 4 pitches, so it's very microtonal. And as these things are playing back, you can turn instruments off or on, add multiple instruments to each voice, etc. So in this case, in the case of the entire piece, every instrument is color-coded. And these were selected, they were the IBM colorblind friendly colors. And then performers could essentially interpret the score however they wanted. And then audiences can then interact and mix them however they want. And the whole piece was inspired by this story by Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentine poet, Argentine writer, called The Garden of Forking Paths. Beautiful story if you haven't read it, but it's the notion that multiple possible outcomes can actually exist at the same time by branching out into like infinite numbers of futures. It's a very sort of philosophical way of thinking about time and possibilities. And I thought that this was a perfect sort of musical vehicle to explore that, where multiple outcomes can exist from the performer's point of view, because the graphic notation offers many different layers of interpretation, but also from the audience's point of view, because you can interact with the different recordings and interpretations live at the same time. And if anyone's curious or wants to participate, people are kind of sending in little interpretations and whatnot. So if you want to take a crack at one, you're more than welcome to.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for telling us about that. I also noticed, that actually reminded me, one of the things that I noticed in a lot of your music is there almost always is some sort of element of unpredictability, like something that like the performer or something with the audience that like brings in an element that like makes it different every time. Is it something you consciously try to do?
More and more I have. You know, I kind of enjoy giving up some control. And I've become a little bit more interested in I guess these sounds or techniques or things that are a little bit harder to notate and a little bit harder to repeat identically every time. And so that's kind of forced me to open the door and say, okay, you know, this section or this thing will just have to be different every time. And from there, it was a slippery slope to graphic notation and a little bit of aleatory and a little bit of unpredictability.
Right, yeah. So a little bit of a change in subject. So you've also written several pieces that were, I guess we might say political in nature, but related to Nicaragua and your home, and some of the struggles that have happened there. And I was just wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about that and talk about your relationship with your home, your original home, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally Nicaraguan, but we currently have a really unfortunate political situation. There's a dictator that's been in and out of power since 1979. And his wife is currently the vice president. So we foresee that it's going to become kind of a dynastic situation. And as a composer and an academic, in quotes, and a professor, I sometimes feel really helpless or overwhelmed at the situation in Nicaragua when I'm sitting kind of comfortably at home writing music for a stage where 30 people might go to a concert. There's an incredible disconnect between what I would like to do and what I can do. And I found that certain, I guess, situations just become, the sort of seeing these things from afar sometimes becomes so overwhelming that I can't help but try to channel that in certain pieces in one way or another. This sort of came to a head in 2018 when students went out to protest that the government cut pensions because of all this horrible corruption. And when retirees went out to protest, the government went and sent police to beat them up. And then students went out to support the pensioners, and a bunch of students got killed. About 300 people got killed by the government. And I felt just a horrible sense of helplessness and anger. And at the time I was writing a piece for solo bassoon, and then I completely decided to rewrite the piece and called it Los Minúsculos, which means the minuscules, which is what the First Lady called the protesters. She said that they were minuscule forces and they don't represent the majority of the country. And I thought that was after a while, then that term got sort of appropriated by the protesters, who called themselves the minuscules proudly. So I named this piece the Minuscules, and it's all about how, again, really very small, delicate sounds coalesce and then are amplified and spatialized around the audience until the point where the sounds, and through like various electronic techniques, recording and layering and delay and things, these sounds begin to spiral out of control until at the end of the piece they've completely immersed the audience into an almost unbearable level of loudness. And I thought that it was maybe wishful thinking, but hoping for some kind of change from these little minuscule forces that were protesting against the government into something that the government would not be able to oppress or to break down. And unfortunately, the situation has continued to devolve, and yeah, it's really sad, and I still find myself kind of obsessing about it, of course, and I can't help but, it's so hard to separate that from the day-to-day of composing that it inevitably seeps into some of my pieces.
Yeah. One of the other ones that is a very recent one, now I'm trying to remember, was the Mombacho, which was inspired by the beautiful scenery of Nicaragua.
Yeah, that was a slightly less depressing piece to write. But that was inspired by this rainforest on the top of a volcano near where I used to live in Granada. And just the sounds of all the little animals and birds and how these sounds would evolve from day to day and month to month was really inspiring. And so this piece, Mombacho, is all about overlapping cyclical changes that gradually change over time. So it was, some of the structures were actually modeled on like kind of data drawn from the volcano, but a lot of them were just created it rather intuitively. And then again, there's this element of spatialization where the instruments, this is a particular piece is for guitar, harp, cymbalum, and double bass, so very plucky sounds. And then these are spatialized around the audience to also create a sense of immersion into this sort of soundscape.
Cool. That actually reminded me, yeah, you have a lot of spatial elements at least the most recent pieces. Is that something that's also been a more recent phenomenon, or is sort of long-term? I don't know.
Yeah, it has been. I mean, the first time I experimented with any kind of spatial placement was, I think 2015, and I just had people in the audience. It was during a music festival, so everyone was a musician. And I had kind of secret performers in the audiences that would whisper things at certain occasions. And the point was to try to break the wall of like, or the separation between the musicians and the audience a little bit, or incorporate a little bit of the sound of the space. And most recently that, yeah, I think it's become an increasingly more important component of my music. Almost to the point where some pieces, it serves a structural role. Like the piece would not be able to be really performed without spatialization.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so in some ways it even serves like a function, a musical function. And it's interesting to think of space that way. It's very hard to conceptualize.
It is, but I like, I think it's really important to find ways to make live music like vital. And I think some of that, like if it's part of the piece, like that you are within it, I think that that's really important. And I like a great way to continue to make audiences feel like, oh, being here matters.
Yeah.
And, you know, its own experience to be there.
That's absolutely true. It really separates the listening with headphones versus listening live experience. I mean, when you can hear things coming from different directions, there's really no way to mimic that at all. You have to be there.
Yeah,
definitely.
So we are kind of getting close towards the end, but I'd love to open it up if you guys have any questions for Gabriel about any of his pieces, like anything
at all.
Ask. No.
So are you all composers? I see. Stan,
like Stan is a composer. He shared with us at our salons before. Caleb is a composer. He's also on staff.
Excellent.
I know Taiba and Wenji are both composers and have been to some of our events before, but maybe they just don't have questions today. I actually was curious. I'll actually go back to your guitar piece and ask just a couple questions. Did you, when you created the mock-up, did you play everything? Was it like you recording?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard because I'm not really a guitarist anymore. But it was good because it was such a weird setup and score for the performers to realize. I wanted to try to make sure I could at least do it myself.
Right.
So that during rehearsals, I'd have, if needed, I could have a much more hands-on.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you if you had worked with the performers yet, but it sounds like since you just finished it yesterday, obviously not.
Not yet. No,
yeah.
I think we were going to meet tomorrow, but it's Veterans Day, so we're postponing a couple days.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm really curious. I assume it'll work, but you never know with these things. Yeah.
But it's always fun when you get to work with performers, and especially one-on-one, to really hammer some things out. So
that was a big reason I think I took so many risks in that piece. I knew I was going to be working with them individually, and so I knew that the score didn't have to sort of stand alone on its own.
Yeah,
yeah, I could be there.
Because and also like as a composer, you know, we're kind of used to being able to look at a score and kind of know what it's going to sound like. And this one definitely, no idea, just based on what it looked like.
Yeah, it'd be a good solfege exercise for
Oh, crazy. Yeah. So, well, I just want to thank you again so much for being our guest. This was fantastic. And we will wrap it up, and we look forward to doing another piece in the future.
I'm excited too.
A couple announcements for BNMI. So our next composer salon will be December sorry, December 5th. I want to make sure I'm saying, no, December 15th. Yes. The next Composer Salon will be December 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and registration is open and available at our tickets website, bostonnewmusic.org/tickets, if you want to share or just come join us, as many of you have. And then our second composer series is going to be with Jared Tate, who's a Chickasaw composer. And he will be sharing with us on January 6th at 7 p.m. So those are our next events. We hope to see many of you there. And thanks again, Gabriel. It was great. It was a wonderful chat.
Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions or anything, I'm happy to share my email, or if they email you, feel free to.
Yeah, here, I will put on the chat here. I'll copy and paste. I'll put your email in there.
Perfect.
And then there we go. There we go. There we go. And also, if you want to check out his stuff, let me make sure. I'm pretty sure I spelled that right. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Wonderful.
Okay.
It was very nice to meet you all. And thanks again for having me. This was wonderful.
All right. Thanks again, Gabriel.
Take care, everyone.